John Bright. Few men in British history, writes George Trevelyan, have exerted so much influence on the thoughts and hearts of his fellow countrymen as has John Bright, and Asa Briggs considers him to be the most important figure in the history of mid-Victorian radicalism. Bright's political contributions occurred during the 30 years commencing with his first association with the Anti-Corn Law League and extending to passage of the Reform Bill of 1867. Most notable among the events of his political career was his participation in the American and franchise questions. Boy, under a bright enough spotlight. But anyhow, it's a little hard to read. Most notable among the events of his political career was his participation in the American and franchise questions. Bright's influence in the Trent affair in 1861 is considered by J. Travis Mills to have been the most singular force which prevented war between Great Britain and the United States. On the franchise question, although ultimate credit for passage of the Reform Bill of 1867 must go to Disraeli, Bright's single-handed agitation at half a dozen vast gatherings probably accounted for the change of mood in the Conservative Party. Trevelyan calls Bright's speeches his one form of perfect achievement, his one great political weapon. Rosebery refers to them as masterpieces of sustained and restrained oratory. In presentation, he used few gestures except to raise his hand occasionally to the level of his breast. But his great asset was his voice, described by Trevelyan as a gift of heaven. He had never to shout in order that it might thrill with its music the farthest corner of the largest hall. In composition, Bright was sensitive to the artistic effect of the proper words spoken in the proper context. Although he wrote verbatim only the peroration, he took great pains to select words which could excite imagery in the minds of his listeners. These expressions often took the form of homely common life allusions. One of Bright's speeches, which serves well to illustrate his speaking style, was presented to the House of Commons March 19, 1869, on the second reading of the Irish Church Bill. Mills says of this speech, "In artistic arrangement, in delicious phrasing, in style, in splendor of imagery, it is worthy alike of the man and of his theme." The speech included in this volume is on the Trent affair and was delivered in Rochdale on December 4, 1861. This was the second of Bright's 14 important speeches on the American question. It took place just 1 week after news had arrived in England of the forcible removal from the British sloop Trent of 2 Confederate envoys, James Mason and John S. Slidell, by Captain Charles Wilkes of the United States Navy. The purpose of this and other speeches on the American question was to instruct the public in Britain on the merits of the Union cause in the Civil War struggle. R.A.J. Walling calls the Rochdale speech the first clear call to sanity amid the thunders of the Times, London, and the ravings of politicians of the baser sort. While Bright sought popular support with the hope of thwarting precipitate military action by the Palmerston government, he urged Lincoln and Seward to release the 2 envoys. This was done on January 9th, and the clouds of war lifted. Although his private business suffered severely from the cotton shortage induced by the Union blockade of southern ports, Bright never wavered in his sympathies for the United States in its struggle against the Confederacy. The Trent Affair, Rokedale, December 4th, 1861. When the gentlemen who invited me to this dinner called upon me, I felt their kindness very sensibly, and now I am deeply grateful to my friends around me, and to you all for the abundant manifestations of it with which I have been received tonight. I am, as you all know, at this moment surrounded by my neighbors and friends, here. And I may say with the utmost truth that I value the good opinion of those who now hear my voice, far beyond the opinion of any equal number of the inhabitants of this country selected from any portion of it. You have, by this great kindness that you have shown me, given a proof that in the main you do not disapprove of my public labors. Cheers. That at least you are willing to express an opinion that the motives by which I have been actuated have been honest and honorable to myself, and that that course has not been entirely without service to my country. Cheers. Coming to this meeting, or to any similar meeting, I always find that the subjects for discussion appear to be infinite, and far more than it is possible to treat. In these times in which we live, by the inventions of the telegraph and the steamboat, and the railroad, and the multiplication of newspapers, we seem continually to stand as on the top of an exceeding high mountain, from which we behold all the kingdoms of the earth, and all the glory of them, and, unhappily, not only their glory, but their crimes, and their follies, and their calamities. Here. 7 years ago, our eyes were turned with anxious expectation to a remote corner of Europe, where 5 nations were contending in bloody strife for an object which, possibly, hardly one of them comprehended, and, if they did comprehend it, which all sensible men among them must have known to be absolutely impracticable. 4 years ago, we were looking still further to the east, and we saw there a gigantic revolt in a great dependency of the British Crown, arising mainly from gross neglect, and from the incapacity of England, up to that moment, to govern a country which it had known how to conquer. 2 years ago, we looked south to the plains of Lombardy. We saw a strife there, in which every man in England took a strange interest. Here. And we have welcomed, as the result of that strife, the addition of a new and great kingdom to the list of European states. Cheers. Well, now our eyes are turned in a contrary direction. We look to the west, and there we see a struggle in progress of the very highest interest to England and to humanity at large. We see there a nation which I shall call the transatlantic English nation, here, the inheritor and partaker of the historic glories of this country, here. We see it torn with intestine broils and suffering from calamities from which for more than a century past, in fact, for nearly 2 centuries past, this country has been exempt. That struggle is of a special interest to us. We remember a description which one of our great poets gives of Rome in its condition of decay. He describes it as lone mother of dead empires. But England is the living mother of great nations on the American and on the Australian continents, and she promises to belt the whole world with her knowledge, her civilization, and even something more than the freedom that she herself enjoys. Cheers. 85 years ago, about the time when some of our oldest townsmen were very little children, there were on the North American continent calamities. I'm having some reading. 85 years ago, about the time when some of our oldest townsmen were very little children, there were on the North American continent colonies, mainly of Englishmen, containing about 3 million souls. These colonies we have seen a year ago constituting the United States of North America and comprising a population of not less than 30 millions of souls. We know that in agriculture and manufacture, with the exception of this kingdom, there is no country in the world which, as to these arts, may be placed in advance of the United States. Applause. With regard to inventions, I believe within the last 30 years, we have received more useful inventions from the United States than we have received from all the countries of Europe. Hear, hear. In that country, there are probably 10 times as many miles of telegraph as there are in this country, and there are at least 5 or 6 times as many miles of railways. The tonnage of its shipping is at least equal to ours, if it does not exceed ours. The prisons of that country, for even in countries the most favored so far, prisons are needful, have been models for the other nations of the earth. And many European governments have sent commissions beyond the Atlantic to inquire into the admirable system of education established universally in their free schools throughout the free and northern states. Cheers. If I were to speak of them in a religious aspect, I should say that within that period of time to which their short history goes back, there is nothing on the face of the earth, and never has been besides, to equal the magnificent arrangement of churches and ministers, and of all the appliances which are thought necessary for a nation to reach morality and Christianity to the people. Besides all this, when I state that for many years past, the annual public expenditure of the government of that country has been somewhere between 10 and 15 millions. I need not perhaps say further that there has existed in that country, among all the people, an amount of comfort and prosperity, of abounding plenty, and such as I believe no other country in the world, in any age, has displayed. This is a very fine, but still a very true picture. Hear, hear. But it has another side, to which I must advert. There has been one great feature in that country, one great contrast, which has been pointed to by all men who have commented upon the United States as a feature of danger and a contrast calculated to give pain. You have had in that country the utmost liberty to the white man, but bondage and degradation to the black man. Now rely upon it that wherever Christianity lives and flourishes, there must grow up from it necessarily a conscience which is hostile to any oppression and to any wrong. And therefore, from the hour when the United States Constitution was formed, so long as it left there this great evil, then comparatively small. It sounds odd to say comparatively in my American voice. It sounds very American. But now becomes so great, it left there the seeds of that which an American statesman has so happily described, of that irrepressible conflict of which now the whole world is witness. Cheers. It has been a common thing for men disposed to carp at the United States to point at this blot upon their fair fame, and to compare it with the boasted Declaration of Equality in their deed and Declaration of Independence. But we must recollect who sowed this seed of trouble, and how and by whom it has been cherished. Without dwelling upon this for more than a moment, I should like to read to you a paragraph from instruction proposed to be given to the Virginian delegates to Congress in the month of August, 1774, and from the pen of Mr. Jefferson, perhaps the ablest man produced in the United States at that time, and actively engaged in its affairs, and who was afterwards, I think, for 2 periods, President of the Republic. He writes this from a slave state, from the state of Virginia. For the most trifling reasons, and sometimes for no conceivable reason at all, His Majesty the King of England has rejected laws of the most salutary tendency. The abolition of domestic slavery is the great object of desire in those colonies where it was unhappily introduced in their infant state. But previous to the enfranchisement of the slaves we have, it is necessary to exclude all further importations from Africa. Yet our repeated attempts to effect this by prohibitions and by imposing duties which might amount to prohibition have been hitherto defeated by His Majesty's negative, thus preferring the immediate advantage of a few British corsairs to the lasting interest of the American states and to the rights of human nature deeply wounded by this infamous practice. Loud cheers. I read that merely to show that 2 years before the Declaration of Independence was signed, Mr. Jefferson, acting on behalf of those whom he represented in Virginia, wrote that protest against the course of the British government which prevented the colonists abolishing the slave trade, preparatory to the abolition of slavery itself. The United States Constitution left the slave question for every state to manage for itself. It was a question then too difficult to settle, apparently, but every man had the hope and belief that in a few years slavery would of itself become extinct. Then there happened that great event in the annals of manufacture and commerce. It was discovered that in those states that article which we in this country so much depend upon could be produced of the best quality needful for manufacturing, and at a moderate price. And from that day to this, growth of cotton has increased there. Its consumption has increased here, and a value which no man dreamt of when Jefferson wrote that paper has been given to slaves and slave industry, and thus it has grown up to that gigantic institution which now threatens either its own overthrow or the overthrow of that which is 1,000,000 times more valued, the great Republic of the United States. Loud cheers. The crisis at which we have arrived now, I say we, for, after all, we are as much interested in the crisis nearly as if I were making this speech in the city of Boston or New York. The crisis which has now arrived was inevitable. I say that the conscience of the North, never satisfied with the institution, was constantly pricking some man forward to take a more extreme view of the question, and there grew up naturally a section, it may be not a very numerous one, in favor of abolition, and a great and powerful party resolved at least upon the restraint and control of slavery, so that it should not extend beyond the states and the area which it now occupies. But now, if we look at the government of the United States, almost ever since the Union, we shall find that the Southern power has been mostly dominant there. If you take 36 years after the formation of the present Constitution, I think about 1787, you will find that for 32 of those years, every president was a Southern man. And if you take the period from 1828 until 1860, you will find that on every election for president, the South voted in the majority. Well, we know what an election is in the United States for President of the Republic. There is a most extended suffrage, and there is a ballot box. The President and the House of Representatives are elected by the same electors, and generally they are elected at the same time. And it follows, therefore, almost inevitably, that the House of Representatives is in complete accord in public policy with the President for the time being. Every 4 years there springs from the vote created by the whole people a president over that great nation. I think the world affords no finer spectacle than this. I think it affords no higher dignity, that there is no greater object of ambition on the political stage on which men are permitted to move. You may point, if you like, to hereditary royalty, to crowns coming down through successive generations in the same families, to thrones based on prescription or on conquest, to scepters wielded over veteran legion or subject realms. But to my mind, there is nothing more worthy of reverence or obedience, nothing more sacred than the authority of the freely chosen magistrate of a great and free people. Loud cheers. And if there be on earth and among men any right divine to govern, surely it rests with a ruler so chosen and so appointed. Cheers. This process of a great election was gone through a year ago, and the South, that had so long been successful, found itself defeated. That defeat was followed instantly by secession, insurrection, and war. In the multitude of articles which have been brought before us in the newspapers within the last several months, I have no doubt you have seen, as I have seen it stated, that this question was very much like that upon which the colonies originally revolted against the Crown of England. It is amazing either how little many newspaper writers know, or how little they think that you know. Laughter. When the War of Independence commenced in America 90 years ago or more, there was no representation there at all. The question was whether a ministry in Downing Street and a corrupt and borough-mongering parliament at Westminster should impose taxes upon 3 millions of English subjects who had left their native country and established themselves in North America. But now the question is not of an underrepresentation or of no representation, because, as is perfectly notorious, the representation of the South is not only complete, but in excess. For in distributing the number of representatives to the number of people, which is done every 10 years in the United States, 3 out of every 5 slaves are counted for the South, as if they were white men and free men, and the number of members given to them is so much greater than it would be if the really free men and white men were only counted. And it has followed from that the South has had in the House of Representatives about 20 members more than it had any right to, upon the principle upon which members were apportioned to the northern and the free states. Therefore, you will see at once that there is no kind of comparison between the state of things when the colonies revolted and the state of things now, when this fearful and wicked insurrection has broken out. But there is another cause, which is sometimes in England assigned for this great misfortune, which is the protective theories in operation in the Union and the maintenance of a high tariff. It happens in regard to this that no American, certainly no one I ever met with, attributes the disaster of the Union to that cause. It is an argument made use of by ignorant Englishmen, but never by informed Americans. Have not I already shown you that the South, during almost the whole existence of the Union, has been dominant at Washington, and during that period the tariff has existed? There has been dissatisfaction occasionally with it, there can be no doubt, and at times the tariff has been higher than was thought just or reasonable or necessary by some of the states of the South. But the very first act of the United States, which levied duties on imports, passed immediately after the Union was formed, recites that it is necessary for the encouragement and protection of manufactures to levy the duties which follow. And during the war with England, from 1812 to 1815, the people of the United States had to pay for all the articles they brought from Europe many times over the natural cost of those articles, on account of the interruption of the traffic by the English Navy. And when the war was over, it was felt by everybody desirable that they should encourage manufactures in their own country. And seeing that England was at that precise moment passing a law to prevent any wheat coming from America until wheat in England had risen to the price of 84 shillings per quarter, we may feel quite satisfied that the doctrines of protection originally entertained did not find less favor at the close of the war in 1815. Now, there is one remarkable point with regard to this matter which should not be forgotten. 12 months ago, at the meeting of the Congress of the United States, which takes place on the first Monday in December, there were various proposals of compromise and committee meetings of various kinds held to try and devise some mode of settling the question between the North and South, so that the disunion might not go on. But though I read carefully everything that was published in the English newspapers from the United States on that subject, I do not recollect that in any single instance the question of the tariff was referred to, or that any change was proposed or suggested in that matter as likely to have any effect whatever upon the question of secession. Here. Now there is another point too, that whatever be the influence of tariffs upon the United States, it is as pernicious to the West as to the South. And further, Louisiana, which is a southern state and a seceded state, has always voted along with Pennsylvania, until last year, in favor of protection for its sugar, while Pennsylvania wished protection for its coal and iron. But if the tariff was onerous and grievous, was that a reason for this great insurrection? Has ever a country had a tariff, especially in the article of food, more onerous and more cruel than that which we had in this country 20 years ago? Cheers. We did not secede. We did not rebel. What we did was to raise money for the purpose of distributing over all the country perfect information upon that question. And many men, as you know, devoted all their labors for several years to teach the great and wise doctrines of free trade to the people of England. Why, the price of a single gunboat, the keep of a single regiment, the garrison of a single fort, the cessation of their trade for a single day, costs more than it would have cost them to spread all over the intelligent people of the United States the most complete statement of the whole question, and West and South, having no interest in protection, could, united, have easily revised, or, if need had been, could have repealed the tariff altogether. No, the question is a very different and far more grave question. It is the question of slavery. Hear, hear. For 30 years, it has been constantly coming to the surface, disturbing social life, and overthrowing almost all political harmony in the working of the United States. In the North, there is no secession. There is no collision. These disturbances and this insurrection are found wholly in the South and in the slave states. And therefore, I think the man who says otherwise, and who contends that it is the tariff or anything whatsoever other than slavery, is either himself deceived or he endeavors to deceive others. The object of the South is this: to escape from the majority which wishes to limit the area of slavery. Here. They wish to found a slave state freed from the influences and the opinion of freedom. The free states in the North, then, now stand before the world the advocates and defenders of freedom and civilization. The slave states of the South offer themselves for the recognition of Christian nations based upon the foundation, the unchangeable foundation in their eyes, of slavery and barbarism. Hear, hear. I will not discuss the guilt of men who, ministers of a great nation, only last year conspired to overthrow it. I will not point out or recapitulate the statements of the fraudulent manner in which they disposed of the funds in the national exchequer. I will not point out by name any of the men in this conspiracy whom history will designate by titles that they will not like to hear. But I say that slavery has sought to break up the most free government in the world and to found a new state in this 19th century whose cornerstone is the perpetual bondage of millions of men. Hear, hear. Having thus described what appears to me briefly the truth of this matter, what is the course that England would be expected to pursue? We should be neutral so far as regards mingling in the strife. We were neutral in the strife in Italy, but we were not neutral in opinion or in sympathy. Hear, hear. You know perfectly well that throughout the whole of Italy, at this moment, there is a feeling that, although no shot was fired from an English ship, though no English soldier trod their soil, still the opinion of England was potent in Europe, and did much for the creation of the Italian kingdom. Here. Well, with regard to the United States, you know how much we hate slavery. That is, a while ago you thought you knew that we had given 20 million pounds, that is, 1 million pounds a year entirely in taxes, to free 800,000 slaves in the English colonies. You knew, or you thought you knew, how much you were in love with free government everywhere, although it might not take precisely the form of our government. Free government in Italy, free government in Switzerland, free government under Republican forms in the United States of America. And with all this, every man would have said that England would wish the American Union to be prosperous and eternal. Now suppose we turn our eyes to the east, to the Empire of Russia, for a moment. In Russia, as you know, there has been one of the most important and magnificent changes of policy ever seen in any country within the last year or two. The present Emperor of Russia, following the wishes of his father, has insisted upon the abolition of serfdom in that empire. Hear, hear. And 25 million human beings, lately serfs, little better than real slaves, have been put in a path of elevation to the ranks of freedom. Now, suppose that the millions of serfs of Russia had been chiefly in the south of Russia. We hear that the nobles of Russia, to whom these serfs belong in a great measure, have been very hostile to this change, and that there has even been some danger that the peace of that empire might be disturbed during this change. Suppose these nobles, for the purpose of maintaining in perpetuity the serfdom of Russia, and barring out 23 millions of your fellow creatures from the rights of freedom, had established a great and secret conspiracy, and had risen in a great and dangerous insurrection against the Russian government. I say that the people of England, although but 7 years ago they were in mortal combat with Russia in the south of Europe, I believe that at this moment they would have prayed heaven in all sincerity and fervor to give strength to the arm and success to the great wishes of the Emperor, and that vile and pernicious insurrection might be suppressed. Great cheering. Now, let us look a little at what has been said and done in this country since the period when Parliament rose in the beginning of August. There have been 2 speeches to which I wish to refer, and in terms of approbation. The Duke of Argyll, a member of the present government, and though I have not the smallest personal acquaintance with him, I am free to say that I believe him to be one of the most intelligent and liberal of his order. Hear, hear. The Duke of Argyll delivered a speech which was fair and friendly to the government of the United States. Lord Stanley, hear, hear, only a fortnight ago made a speech which it is impossible to read without remarking the thought, the liberality, and the wisdom by which it is distinguished. He doubted, it is true, whether the Union could be restored. But a man need not be hostile, and must not necessarily be friendly, to doubt that, or the contrary. But he spoke with fairness and friendliness of the government of the United States, and he said they were right and justifiable in the course they took. Here. And he gave a piece of advice, now more important than it was ever, now more important than it was even at the moment when he gave it, that in the various incidents and accidents of a struggle of this nature, it became a people like this to be very moderate and very calm, and to avoid getting into that feeling of irritation which sometimes arises and sometimes leads to danger. Hear, hear. I mention these two speeches as from noblemen of great distinction in this country. Speeches which I believe would have a beneficial effect on the other side of the Atlantic. Lord John Russell, in the House of Commons during the last session, made a speech in which he rebuked the impertinence of a young member of the House who spoke about the bursting of the bubble republic. Hear, hear, and cheers. It was a speech worthy of the best days of Lord John Russell. Cheers. But at a later period, he spoke at Newcastle, and on an occasion something like that, when the inhabitants, or some portion of the inhabitants of that town, invited him to a public dinner. He described the contest in words something like these, I speak only from memory, that the North is contending for empire and the South for independence. Did he mean that the North was contending for empire, as England, when making some fresh conquest in India? If he meant that, what he said was not true. But I recollect Lord John Russell, in the House of Commons some years ago, on an occasion when I had made some observations as to the unreasonable expenditure of the colonies, and complained that the people of England should be taxed to defray the expenses which the colonies themselves should well be able to bear, turned to me with a sharpness which was not necessary, and said, "The honourable member has no objection to make a great empire into a small one, but I have." Loud cheers and laughter. Perhaps if he lived in the United States, if he were a member of the Senate or House of Representatives there, he would doubt whether it was his duty to consent at once to the destruction of a great country, to its separation, it may be, into two hostile camps, or whether he would not try all means open to him and open to the government to avert so unlooked for and so dire a calamity. There are other speeches that have been made. I will not refer to them by any quotation. I will not, out of pity to some of the men who have uttered them. Laughter and cheers. I will not bring their names even before you, to give to them an endurance which I hope they will not have. Hear, hear. But I will leave them in the obscurity which they so richly merit. Cheers. But now you know as well as I do that of all the speeches made since the end of the session of Parliament by public men and politicians, the majority of them displayed either strange ignorance of American affairs or a strange absence of that cordiality and friendship which, I maintain, our American kinsmen had a right to look for at our hands. Hear, hear. And if we part from the speakers and turn to the writers, what do we find there? We find that which is reputed abroad and has hitherto been reputed at home as the most powerful representative of English opinion, at least of the richer classes. We find that in that particular newspaper there has not been, since Mr. Lincoln took office in March last as President of the United States, one fair and honorable and friendly article on American affairs. Hear, hear. Some of you, I dare say, read it, but fortunately now every district is so admirably supplied with local newspapers that I trust in all time to come the people of England will drink of purer streams nearer home. Cheers and laughter. And not from those streams which are muddied by party feeling and political intrigues, and by many motives that tend to anything rather than the enlightenment and advantage of the people. Now it has been said, and by that very paper, over and over again, why this war? Why not separate peacefully? Why this fratricidal strife? I hope they will all be against fratricidal strife in other respects. For, if it is true that God has made of one blood all the families of men to dwell on the face of all the earth, it must be a fratricidal strife, whether we are slaughtering Russians in the Crimea or bombarding the towns on the seacoast of the United States. Cheers. Now, no none will expect that I feel like that's supposed to be no one. No one will expect that I should stand forward as the advocate of war, or the defender of that great sum of all crime which is involved in war. But when you are discussing a question of this nature, it is only fair you should discuss it upon principles which are acknowledged not only in the country where the strife is being carried on, but all but universally acknowledged in this country. When I discussed the question of the Russian war 7 or 8 years ago, I always discussed it on the principles which were avowed by the government and the people of England, and I took my facts from the blue books which were presented to Parliament. I take the liberty of doing that now in this case. I say that, looking at the principles avowed in England and at all its policy, there is no man that is not absolutely a non-resistant in every sense who can fairly challenge the conduct of the American government in this war. It is a curious thing to find that the party in this country, which on every public question is in favor of war at any cost, when it comes to speak of that duty of the government of the United States, is in favor of peace at any price. Hear, hear. I want to know whether it has ever been admitted by politicians and statesmen, or by any people, that great nations can be broken up at any time by the will of any particular section of those nations. It has been tried occasionally in Ireland. Laughter. And if it had succeeded, history would have said, with very good cause. Hear, hear. But if anybody tries now to get up a secession or insurrection in Ireland, which would be infinitely less disturbing to everything than secession in the United States, because there is a boundary which nobody can dispute, I am quite sure the Times newspaper would have special correspondence and would describe with all the glowing exultation in the world the manner in which the Irish insurrectionists were cut down and made an end of. Let any man in England, let any man try in England to restore the heptarchy. Do you think that any politician in this country would think it a thing to be tolerated for a moment? But if you will look at the map of the United States, you will see that there is no country in the world, probably at this moment, where any plan of separation between North and South, as far as the question of boundary is concerned, is so surrounded with insurmountable difficulties. For example, Maryland is a slave state, but Maryland has, by a very large majority, voted for the Union. Would Maryland go south or north? Kentucky is a slave state, and one of the finest in the Union, containing a fine people. Kentucky has voted for the Union, but has been invaded from the south. Missouri is a slave state. Missouri has not seceded, but it has been invaded from the south, and there is a secession party in that state. There are parts of Virginia which have formed themselves into a new state, resolving to adhere to the North, and there is no doubt a considerable Northern and Union feeling in the state of Tennessee, and I have no doubt that there is in every other state. Indeed, I am not sure that there is not now within the sound of my voice a citizen of the United States, a citizen of the state of Alabama, who can tell you that there the question of secession has never been put to the vote, and that there are great numbers of most reasonable, thoughtful, and just men in the state who entirely deplore the condition of things there existing. Well then, what would you do with all these states, and with what may be called the loyal portion of the population of these states? Would you allow them to be dragooned into this insurrection, and into becoming parts of a new state, to which they themselves are hostile? But what would you do with the city of Washington? Washington is in a slave state. Would anybody have advised President Lincoln and his cabinet, and all the members of Congress, House of Representatives and Senate, from the North, with their wives and children, and everybody else who was not positively in favor of the South, to set off on their melancholy pilgrimage northwards, leaving that capital, hallowed to them by such associations, having its name even from the father of their country, leaving Washington to the south, because Washington is situated in a slave state? Again, what do you say to the Mississippi River, as you see it upon the map, the father of waters, rolling that gigantic stream to the ocean? Do you think that the 50 millions which one day will occupy the banks of that river northward will ever consent to that great stream, that that great stream should roll through a foreign, and it may be a hostile state? And more, there are 4 millions of Negroes in subjection. For them, the American Union is directly responsible. They are not secessionists. They are now, as they always were, not citizens nor subjects, but legally under the care and power of the government of the United States. Would you consent that these should be delivered up to the tender mercies of their taskmasters, the defenders of a slavery as an everlasting institution? Cheers. Well, if all had been surrendered without a struggle, what then? What would the writers in this newspaper and other newspapers have said if a bare rock in your empire that would not keep a single goat alive, be touched by any foreign power? Why, the whole empire is roused to resistance. And if there be, from accident or from passion, the smallest insult to your flag, what do your newspaper writers say upon that subject? And what is said in all your towns and upon all your exchanges? I will tell you what they would have said if the government of the United States and the North had taken their insidious and dishonest advice. They would have said, the great republic is a failure, and democracy has murdered patriotism, that history affords no example of such meanness and of such cowardice. And they would have heaped unmeasured obloquy and contempt upon the people and government who had taken that course. Loud cheering. Well, they tell you, these candid friends of the United States, they tell you that all freedom is gone, that the Habeas Corpus Act, if they ever had one, is known no longer, and that any man may be arrested at the dictum of the President or of the Secretary of State. Well, but in 1848, you recollect, many of you, that there was a small insurrection in Ireland. It was an absurd thing altogether, but what was done then? I saw in one night, in the House of Commons, a bill for the suspension of the Habeas Corpus Act passed through all its stages. What more did I see? I saw a bill brought in by the Whig government of that day, Lord John Russell being the premier, which made speaking against the government and against the crown, which up to that time had been sedition, which proposed to make it felony. And it was only by the greatest exertions of a few of the members that that act, in that particular, was limited to a period of 2 years. In the same session, a bill was brought in called an Alien Bill, which enabled the Home Secretary to take any foreigner whatsoever, not being a naturalized Englishman, and in 24 hours to send him out of the country. Although a man might have committed no crime, this might be done to him apparently only on suspicion. But suppose that an insurgent army had been so near to London that you could see its outposts from every suburb of London. What then do you think would have been the regard of the government of Great Britain for personal liberty if it interfered with the necessity, and as they might think, with the salvation of the state? I recollect in 1848, when the Habeas Corpus Act was suspended, that a number of persons in Liverpool, men there of position and of wealth, presented a petition to the House of Commons, praying, what? That the Habeas Corpus Act should not be suspended? No, but they were not content with its suspension in Ireland, praying the House of Commons to extend that suspension to Liverpool. Laughter. I recollect that at that time, and I am sure my friend Mr. Wilson will bear me out in what I say, the mayor of Liverpool telegraphed to the mayor of Manchester, and the messages were sent on to London nearly every hour. And the mayor of Manchester heard from the mayor of Liverpool that certain Irishmen in Liverpool, conspirators or fellow conspirators with those in Ireland, were going to burn the cotton warehouses of Liverpool and the cotton mills of Lancashire. Laughter. And I read that petition. I took it from the table of the House of Commons and read it, and I handed it over to a statesman of great eminence, who has been but just removed from us, a man not second to any in the House of Commons for his knowledge of affairs and for that his great capacity. I refer to Sir James Graham. Hear, hear. I handed to him this petition. He read it, and after he had read it, he rose from his seat and laid it upon the table with a gesture of abhorrence and disgust. Loud cheers. Now that was a petition from the town of Liverpool, in which some persons have lately been making themselves very ridiculous by their conduct in this matter. Hear, hear. There is one more point. It has been said how much better it would be, not for the United States, but for us that these states should be divided. I recollect meeting a gentleman in Bond Street one day before the session was over, a rich man, and one whose voice is very much heard in the House of Commons. But his voice is not heard there when he is on his legs, but when he is cheering other speakers. Laughter. And he said to me, after all, this is a sad business about the United States, but I still think it is very much better that they should be split up. In 20 years, or in 50 years, I forget which it was, they will be so powerful that they will bully all Europe. Laughter. And a distinguished member of the House of Commons, distinguished there by his eloquence, distinguished more by his many writings, I mean Sir Edward Bulwer-Lytton. He did not exactly express a hope, but he ventured on something like a prediction that the time would come when there would be, I don't know how many, but as many republics or states in America as you can count upon your fingers. There cannot be a meaner motive than this that I am speaking of in forming a judgment on this question, that it is better for us. For whom? The people of England or the government of England? That the United States should be severed, and that the continent should be as the continent of Europe is, in many states, and subject to all the contentions and disasters which have accompanied the history of the states of Europe. Applause. I should say that if a man had a great heart within him, he would rather look forward to the day when, from that point of land which is habitable nearest to the pole, to the shores of the great Gulf, the whole of that vast continent might become one great federation of states, that without a great army and without a great navy, not mixing itself up with the entanglements of European politics, without a customs house inside through the whole length and breadth of its territory. but with freedom everywhere, equality everywhere, law everywhere, peace everywhere, would afford at last some hope that man is not forsaken of heaven, and that the future of our race might be better than the past. Prolonged cheering. It is a common observation that our friends in America are very irritable. Well, I think it is very likely of a considerable number of them to be quite true. Our friends in America are involved in a great struggle. There is nothing like it before in their history. No country in the world was ever more entitled, in my opinion, to the sympathy and the forbearance of all friendly nations than are the United States at this moment. Hear, hear. They have their newspapers that are no wiser than ours. Laughter. They have there some papers, one at least, which up to the election of Mr. Lincoln were his bitterest and unrelenting foes. But when the war broke out, and it was not safe to take the line of Southern support, were obliged to turn round and to support the prevalent opinion of the country. But they undertook to serve the South in another way, and that was by exaggerating every difficulty and misstating every fact, if so doing could serve their object of creating distrust between the people of the northern states and the people of this United Kingdom. Hear, hear. If the Times in this country has done all that it could to poison the minds of the people of England and to irritate the minds of the people of America, the New York Herald, I am sorry to say, has done, I think, all that it could or that it dared to provoke mischief between the government in Washington and the government in London. Hear, hear. Now there is one thing which I must state, that I think they have a solid reason to complain of, and I am very sorry to have to mention it, because it blames our present foreign minister, against whom I am not anxious to say a word, and, recollecting his speech in the House of Commons, I should be slow to conclude that he had any feeling hostile to the United States government. You recollect that during the session, it was on the 14th of May, a proclamation came out which acknowledged the South as a belligerent power and proclaimed the neutrality of England. A little time before that, I forget how many days, Mr. Dallas, the late minister from the United States, had left London for Liverpool and for America. He did not wish to undertake any affairs for this government, by which he was not appointed. I mean that of President Lincoln. And he left what had to be done to his successor, who was on his way, and whose arrival was daily expected. Mr. Adams, the present minister from the United States, is a man who, if he lived in England, you would say was of one of the noblest families of the country. I think his father and his grandfather were president of the United States. His grandfather was one of the great men who achieved the independence of the United States. There is no family in that country having more claims upon what I should call the veneration and the affection of the people than the family of Mr. Adams. Mr. Adams came to this country. He arrived in London on the night of the 13th of May. On the 14th, that proclamation was issued. It was known that he was coming, but he was not consulted. The proclamation was not delayed for a day, although nothing pressed that he might be notified about it. If communications of a friendly nature had taken place with him and with the American government, they could have found no fault with this step, because it was almost inevitable, before the struggle had proceeded far, that this proclamation would be issued. But I have the best reasons for knowing that there is no single thing that has happened during the course of these events which has created more surprise, more irritation, and more distrust in the United States with respect to this country than the fact that that proclamation did not wait one single day until the minister from America could come here, and until it could be done with his consent or concurrence, and in that friendly manner that would have avoided all the unpleasantness which has occurred. Hear, hear. Now, I am obliged to say, and I say it with the utmost pain, that without this country doing things that were hostile to the North, and without men expressing affection for slavery, and outwardly and openly hatred for the Union, I say that there has not been here that friendly and cordial neutrality which, if I had been a citizen of the United States, I should have expected. And I say further, that if there has existed considerable irritation at that, it must be taken as a measure of the high appreciation which the people of those states place upon the opinion of the people of England. Hear, hear. If I had been addressing this audience 10 days ago, so far as I know, I should have said just what I have said now, and although by an untoward event circumstances are somewhat, even considerably altered, yet I have thought it desirable to make this statement, with a view, so far as I am able to do it, to improve the opinion in England, and to assuage, if there be any, the feelings of irritation in America, so that no further difficulties may arise in the progress of this unhappy strife. Hear, hear. But there has occurred an event which was announced to us only a week ago, which is one of great importance, and it may be one of some peril. Hear, hear. It is asserted that what is called international law has been broken by the seizure of the Southern Commissioners on board an English trading steamer by a steamer of war of the United States. Now, what is maritime law? You have heard that the opinions of the law officers of the Crown are in favor of this view of the case, that the law has been broken. I am not at all going to say that it has not. It would be imprudent in me to set my opinion on a legal question which I have only partially examined against their opinion on the same question, which I presume they have carefully examined. But this I say, that maritime law is not to be found in an act of Parliament. It is not in so many clauses. You know that it is difficult to find the law. I can ask the mayor, or any magistrate around me, whether it is not very difficult to find the law, even when you have found the Act of Parliament and found the clause. But when you have no Act of Parliament and no clause, you may imagine that the case is still more difficult. Hear, hear. Maritime law, or international law, consists of opinions and precedents for the most part, and it is very unsettled. The opinions are the opinions of men of different countries, given at different times, and the precedents are not always like each other. The law is very unsettled, and, for the most part, I believe it to be exceedingly bad. In past times, as you know from the histories you read, this country has been a fighting country. We have been belligerents, and, as belligerents, we have carried maritime law by our own powerful hand to a pitch that has been very oppressive to foreign and peculiarly to neutral nations. Now, almost for the first time, unhappily, in our history for the last 200 years, we are not belligerents, but neutrals, and we are disposed to take, perhaps, rather a different view of maritime and international law. The act which has been committed by the American steamer, in my opinion, whether it was illegal or not, was both impolitic and bad. That is my opinion. I think it may turn out, and is almost certain, that, so far as the taking those men from that ship was concerned, it was wholly unknown to and unauthorized by the American government. And if the American government believe, on the opinion of their law officers, that the act is illegal, I have no doubt they will make fitting reparation, for there is no government in the world that has so strenuously insisted upon modifications of international law, and been so anxious to be guided always by the most moderate and merciful interpretation of that law. Our great advisors of the Times newspaper have been persuading people that this is merely one of a series of acts which denote the determination of the Washington government to pick a quarrel with the people of England. But did you ever know anybody who was not very near dead drunk, who, having as much upon his hands as he could manage, would offer to fight everybody about him? Prolonged laughter and cheering. Do you believe that the United States government, preceded over by President Lincoln, so constitutional in all his acts, so moderate as he has been, representing at this moment that great party in the United States, happily now in the ascendancy, which has always been specially in favor of peace, and specially in favor of England? Do you believe that that government, having upon its hands now an insurrection of the most formidable character in the South, would invite the armies and the fleets of England to combine with that insurrection, and it might be, though it did exasperate the struggle, render it impossible that the Union should ever again be restored? Loud cheers. I say that single statement, whether it came from a public writer or a public speaker, is enough to stamp him forever with the character of being an insidious enemy of both countries. Cheers. Well, what have we seen during the last week? People have not been, I am told, I have not seen much of it, quite so calm as sensible men should be. Here is a question of law. I will undertake to say that when you have from the United States government, if they think the act legal, a statement of their view of the case, they will show you that 50 or 60 years ago, during the wars of that time, there were scores of cases that were at least as bad as this, and some infinitely worse. And if it were not so late tonight, and I am not anxious now to go into this question further, I could easily place before you cases of wonderful outrage, committed by us when we were at war, and for many of which, I am afraid, little or no reparation was offered. But let us bear this in mind, that during this struggle, incidents and accidents will happen. Bear in mind the advice of Lord Stanley, so opportune and so judicious. Don't let your newspapers or your public speakers or any man take you off your guard and bring you into that frame of mind under which your government, if it desires war, can have it with the public assent, or, if it does not desire war, may be driven to engage in it, for one may be as evil and fatal as the other. What can be now more monstrous than that we, as we call ourselves, to some extent, an educated, a moral, and a Christian nation, at a moment when an accident of this kind so occurs, before we have made a representation to the American government, before we have heard a word from them in reply, should be all up in arms, every sword leaping from its scabbard, and every man looking about for his pistols and his blunderbusses? Cheers. Why I think the conduct pursued, and I have no doubt it is pursued by a certain class in America just the same, is much more the conduct of savages than of Christian and civilized men. No, let us be calm. Hear, hear. You recollect how we were dragged into the Russian war, drifted into it. Cheers. You know that I, at least, have not upon my head any of the guilt of that fearful war. Hear, hear. You know that it cost 100 millions of money to this country, that it cost, at least, the lives of 40,000 Englishmen, that it disturbed your trade, that it nearly doubled the armies of Europe, that it placed the relations of Europe on a much less peaceful footing than before, and that it did not affect one single thing of all those that it was promised to effect. Cheers. I recollect speaking on this subject within the last 2 years to a man whose name I have already mentioned, Sir J. Graham, in the House of Commons. He was a minister at the time of that war. He was reminding me of a severe onslaught which I had made upon him and Lord Palmerston for attending a dinner on the Reform Club when Sir C. Napier was appointed to the command of the Baltic Fleet, and he remarked, "What a severe thrashing!" Laughter. I had given them in the House of Commons. I said, "Sir James, tell me candidly, did you not deserve it?" He said, "Well, you were entirely right about that war. We were entirely wrong, and we never should have gone into it." Loud cheers. And this is exactly what everybody will say if you go into a war about this business when it is over. when your sailors and your soldiers, so many of them as may be slaughtered, are gone to their last account, when your taxes are increased, your business permanently, it may be, injured, and when embittered feelings for generations have been created between America and England, then your statesmen will tell you that we ought not to have gone into the war. Cheers. But they will very likely say, as many of them tell me, what could we do in the frenzy of the public mind? Let them not add to the frenzy. Hear, hear. And let us be careful that nobody drives us into that frenzy. Remembering the past, remembering at this moment the perils of a friendly people, and seeing the difficulties by which they are surrounded, let us, I entreat of you, see if there be any real moderation in the people of England. And if magnanimity, so often to be found among individuals, is not absolutely wanting in a great nation. Great cheering. Government may discuss this matter. They may arrange it. They may arbitrate it. I have received here, since I came into this room, a dispatch from a friend of mine in London referring to this question. I believe some portion of it is in the papers this evening, but I have not seen them. But he states that General Scott, whom you know by name, who has come over from America to France, being in a bad state of health, the general, lately, of the American army, and a man of a reputation in that country, not second hardly to that which the Duke of Wellington held during his lifetime in this country. General Scott has written a letter on the American difficulty. He denies that the Cabinet of Washington had ordered the seizure of the Southern Commissioners, even if under a neutral flag. The question of legal right involved in the seizure the general thinks a very narrow ground on which to force a quarrel with the United States. As to Messrs. Slidell and Mason being or not being contraband, the general answers for it that, if Mr. Seward cannot convince Earl Russell that they bore that character, Earl Russell will not be able to convince Mr. Seward that they did not. He pledges himself that if this government cordially agrees with that of the United States in establishing the immunity of neutrals from the oppressive right of search and seizure on suspicion, the Cabinet of Washington will not hesitate to purchase so great a boon to peaceful trading vessels. Great cheering. Before I sit down, let me ask, what is this people, about which so many men in England at this moment are writing, and speaking and thinking with harshness, with injustice, if not with great bitterness? 2 centuries ago, multitudes of the people of this country found a refuge on the North American continent, escaping from the tyranny of the Stuarts and from the bigotry of Laud. Many noble spirits from our country endeavored to establish great experiments in favor of human freedom on that continent. Bancroft, the greatest historian of his own country, has said, in his own graphic and emphatic language, the history of the colonization of America is the history of the crimes of Europe. Hear, hear. From that time down to our own period, America has admitted the wanderers from every clime. Since 1815, a time which many here remember, and which is within my lifetime, more than 3 millions of persons have emigrated from the United Kingdom to the United States. During the 15 years from 1845 or 1846 to 1859 or 1860, a time so recent that we all remember the events, even the most trivial circumstances that have happened in that time. During those 15 years, more than 2,320,000 persons left the shores of the United Kingdom as emigrants for the states of North America. At this very moment then, there are millions in the United States who personally or whose immediate parents have at one time been citizens of this country, and perhaps known to some of the oldest of those whom I am now addressing. They found a home in the far west. They subdued the wilderness. They met with plenty there, which was not afforded them in their native country, and they are become a great people. There may be those persons in England who are jealous of the states. There may be men who dislike democracy and who hate a republic. There may be even those whose sympathies warm toward the slave oligarchy of the South. But of this I am certain, that only misrepresentation the most gross, or calumny the most wicked, can sever the tie which unites the great mass of the people of this country with their friends and brethren beyond the Atlantic. Loud cheers. Whether the Union will be restored or not, or the South will achieve an unhonored independence or not, I know not, and I predict not. But this I think I know, that in a few years, a very few years, that 20 millions of free men in the North will be 30 millions, or even 50 millions, a population equal to or exceeding that of this kingdom. Hear, hear. When that time comes, I pray that it may not be said among them that in the darkest hour of their country's trials, England, the land of their fathers, looked on with icy coldness and saw unmoved the perils and the calamities of her children. Cheers. As for me, I have but this to say. I am one in this audience, and but one in the citizenship of this country. But if all other tongues are silent, mine shall speak for that policy which gives hope to the bondsmen of the South and tends to generous thoughts and generous words and generous deeds between the two great nations that speak the English language and from their origin are alike entitled to the English name. Great cheering. Next will be Benjamin Disraeli, also from Delaney Hall.